My name is Marcia A. Murphy. Mental Health Initiatives, the Plight of the Mentally Ill, and How the Church Can Help. 1 in 17 people suffer from a severe mental illness in a given year. Life is a constant process of emancipation, not only for oneself, but also publicly, helping others. My story and the implications for community involvement. My life has been devastated by mental illness. I am in recovery from schizophrenia, clinical depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. It's been a long, hard fight, but I've had the best physicians and nurses to aid me in my struggle. Without them, I never would have made it. As a young child, I enjoyed school very much. At age 15 in the 9th grade, I was elected president of the student government, the first girl to hold this office in the school's history. But there was a lot of turmoil and strife in my home. As a result, I became depressed and withdrawn and overdosed on aspirin in a suicide attempt. My parents arranged counseling for me with a psychiatric nurse. In my senior year of high school, I considered joining the Peace Corps after graduation, but a school guidance counselor discouraged me because I was having trouble finishing my classwork. Periodically, I was cutting my wrist. I barely managed to graduate. Over the years, I had participated in competitive tennis, and at this time, I was invited to work out with tennis pros in California. My parents could not afford the expense, so I gave tennis lessons in a small town south of Des Moines, Iowa, over the summer. Then I returned home. Because of violence in my home that was directed toward me and my inability to cope, I was easy prey for the Unification Church, the cult of the Korean Sun Myung Moon. A member approached me on the street and invited me to a presentation. It didn't take me long to join. The living conditions in the cult were harsh. The leaders used sleep and food deprivation, constant lectures, and group activities as brainwashing techniques. After 2.5 years and while in New York City, I became psychotic. I had terrifying hallucinations. Demonic voices surrounded and bombarded me with obscenities and false accusations. I was unable to communicate my terror to anyone. Voices continued for 1.5 years until I returned home. I was first treated as an outpatient, then hospitalized. I believe I nearly lost my soul while in the cult. There did occur during this turbulent time a spiritual event consisting of hope and light, yet I failed to respond. I was first treated as an inpatient at the University of Iowa Psychiatric Hospital in 1977. It was originally called the University of Iowa Psychopathic Hospital, completed in 1921. This facility was the first academic psychiatric hospital west of the Mississippi. This is a 1935 photo. I was a patient there for a few times in the 1970s and 80s. It is now called the Medical Education Building and is used for a medical student microbiology laboratory, physical therapy teaching, and psychiatry research. I emerged from the hospital an emotional wreck. During my hospitalization, the voices were mostly quelled, but other problems remained. I experienced clinical depression, lack of motivation, extreme social isolation, and crushing poverty, which included insufficient clothing and food. When I heard voices, they were softer in volume than they had been before. After living in a psychiatric halfway house for women for several months, I stayed in a series of single rooms and apartments. During the next 20 years, I tried to attend church, but usually lacked transportation. Especially in the winter months, it was too difficult to walk. I failed at employment countless times and became involved in a series of abusive relationships. Finally, these problems overwhelmed me, and I gave up. My life reached its lowest point when I nearly succeeded in killing myself at 39 years of age. One frigid January night, I overdosed on medication along with wine. The physicians in the emergency room didn't think I would last the night, but by the grace of God, I survived. Gradually, 3 major factors brought improvement in my condition and started me on the road to recovery. I recommitted my life to a religious faith and practice. I was started on a more effective medication. And third was my involvement in volunteer work at St. Andrew Presbyterian Church and later at the University of Iowa Hospitals and Clinics. I've been working in the patient's library for nearly 10 years, which, among other things, has increased my social skills. In our hardest moments come the toughest questions and the deepest answers. Spirituality, alongside of biology and other factors, has been an integral part of my recovery. I have found it essential for healing the physical, emotional, and psychological suffering inherent in illness. I believe in an integrated or holistic approach to treatment. A holistic view is needed to validate the interconnectedness of body, mind, and spirit. My search for answers to the complex problems of mental illness took me to numerous libraries. There I studied literature concerning the various perspectives of psychosis. I was particularly drawn to religious aspects of illness and healing. Recent studies suggest that people who experience mental illness and also have religious faith fare better than those who do not. Some studies show that prayer may decrease depression and anxiety, as well as increase overall functioning. This was my own experience. As in my case, many people with schizophrenia attempt suicide, but there are also many others who succeed in ending their lives. A UI psychiatric expert told me that 40 to 50 out of 100 people who have schizophrenia attempt suicide during their lifetimes. 10 out of 100 succeed in ending their lives. I personally have experienced all the risk factors for suicide: hopelessness, loss of control of self and one's life, poverty, social isolation, and emotional and physical pain. Hopelessness in particular has been a major issue for me, but out of spirituality has come hope. With hope there is a possibility of change and a future. Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard wrote that possibility is for the self what oxygen is for breathing. I would like to give my definition of recovery. Recovery from mental illness does not necessarily mean the absence of all symptoms. It is when a person has reached a level of stability where they can take part in meaningful work and form significant relationships, thereby contributing to society. Mental illness does not define the person. Identity comes from positive sources. Mental illness. It can shake our foundations and call into question our life direction. It can also be a crucible in which we find deep truths about ourselves and an occasion for distilling new clarity about our purpose and our path. Public attitudes and the outcasts. Where does the church stand? Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. For 12 years, I attended an ecumenical Bible study for women of all ages. Early in my attendance, I shared with the group that I had a mental illness. I found several older women who lovingly took me under their wings. However, none of my peers extended a hand in friendship, except for a woman with bipolar disorder, and a woman young enough to be my daughter who later became a Mennonite pastor also became a friend. The women of my own age, my peers, gave, as Martin Luther King stated, lukewarm acceptance. They may have interacted with me in a superficial manner, but for the most part they kept their distance, and on at least 2 occasions I was outright rejected. Later, after I stopped attending the Bible study, I published a memoir about my experience with mental illness. Then a few from the group who read my book became more accepting. Fear of mental illness can lead to cruelty. Mental illness is a scary idea. It can be unpredictable, and it often makes people nervous. The idea of people being out of control is frightening to the public. I know what it is like to be devalued and stigmatized by relatives and society in general. I have been treated disrespectfully, abused, ridiculed, discriminated against, denied medical and dental care, and denied housing. The ultimate stigmatization, extermination, mental illness as a genocidal marker. Contrast of public attitudes toward the disabled, including the mentally ill. Nazi Germany versus Jesus Christ. In my research, I came upon examples that clearly show the polarity of public attitudes toward the disabled toward the mentally ill. Contrast what happened in Nazi Germany with the attitude of Christ. A look at history may help clarify problems the mentally ill have faced and what they continue to encounter even in today's world. I learned that the Nazi AktionT4 program from 1939 through the Holocaust was responsible for the murder of over 100,000 disabled German citizens, babies, children, adults, and the elderly, mentally ill, feeble-minded, and physically disabled. This was done by gassing, lethal injection, and starvation, a program developed by the leading German academics and administered by top-ranking physicians and nurses. Originally, the killings were conducted in secret. The program was eventually uncovered, and a Roman Catholic priest, Clement August van Galen, made a public protest in 1941. He gained widespread support, and then the operations were gradually moved underground by the Nazis into Poland. The Nazi AktionT4 program was a heinous and systematic way to eliminate the weak, the useless eaters, the undesirables, those with no economical value. It was used to eliminate those individuals considered to be life unworthy of life. The mentally ill who were also exterminated were considered all of these things. In contrast, Jesus Christ. In God's economy, love is primary. News about him spread all over Syria, and people brought to him all who were ill with various diseases, those suffering severe pain, the demon-possessed, those having seizures, and the paralyzed, and he healed them. Matthew 4:24. Jesus Christ, the most compassionate example in all of Scripture. People who have a mental illness are the lepers of Western culture, the outcasts. Here is how Christ responded to an outcast. A man with leprosy came to him and begged him on his knees, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Filled with compassion, Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said. "Be clean." Immediately the leprosy left him and he was cured. Mark 1:40-42. About a year ago, I toured the Johnson County Poor Farm, which included the insane asylum wing, and I took these photos. Had I lived between 1859 through 1886 in Johnson County, I might have been imprisoned here. This poor farm was constructed in 1855. The insane asylum wing was added in 1859 and was in use for 27 years. After that, they kept hogs in the building. The mentally ill were kept in cells like criminals. You can see the little slot where the food was passed through. The stove in the hallway was the only source of heat, so you can imagine how cold people were in the winter months, especially the ones in cells some distance from the stove. The structure's walls were only of thin wooden boards. As you can see, great strides have been made in the care and treatment of the mentally ill. Currently, at the University of Iowa hospitals and clinics, the modern psychiatric units, 1991 to the present, are located on the first 2 floors of the John Papajohn Pavilion. 100% of admissions to these units are acute cases, which means it is a crisis situation in which someone is considered to be either a danger to themselves or to others. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Spiritual hunger, communion, filling a need. Involvement of the church is important because so many people with mental illness long for spiritual care. This story was reported by the Reverend Dr. Doug Ronsheim in Presbyterians Today, October 2012 issue. One year during Holy Week, a pastor and an elder went to the local psychiatric hospital to share communion with a woman in their congregation who was being treated for schizophrenia. They met in a room with plexiglass walls that made it possible for a staff member to view all of the patients. After praying before communion, the pastor looked up and noticed 3 patients gazing at them through the walls. 2 of them, one standing and the other kneeling, had their hands cupped in front of them. The 3rd patient kept her eyes fixed hungrily on the bread and cup. What the church can do, concrete steps. Let me describe some of the concrete ways the church can help. These ideas come from my own involvement with St. Andrew Presbyterian Church in Iowa City, Iowa. These are just some examples. Other churches may come up with other programs. To give you context, let me explain that for most of my adult life, I have lived on less monthly income than what most couples spend on a weekend of fun in Chicago. What the church can do, provide physical and mental health care. We need more men and women who are willing to go into medicine and nursing and into the field of psychiatry. There is currently a shortage of psychiatric professionals, and so this contributes to the inaccessibility of treatment for the mentally ill. Besides doctors and nurses, the field needs social workers, counselors, and case managers. It is also important for medical and dental clinics to begin to open their doors to low-income people. Right now, many of the poor are turned away, even when they are on government programs that would pay for their care. What the church can do, free lunch program and crisis center food bank. Many years ago, in 1983, I helped prepare the first meal for the Iowa City free lunch program that was organized by 2 counselors from the Community Mental Health Center. I knew what it felt like to be hungry. There are now many religious and civic organizations involved in preparing these meals. In this photo, the St. Andrew group is shown preparing a meal for the free lunch program. There are usually about 120 people who eat there daily, Monday through Saturday. As was my own experience, many of the mentally ill live in extreme poverty, some without kitchens or transportation to food banks. At one time in my own life, I lived in a single room with only a hot plate to cook on. Many of the mentally ill find these nutritious meals very helpful, even life-saving. New volunteers to help with the free lunch are always welcome. If people prefer not to work at the kitchen preparing meals, they can donate casseroles or other main dishes, salads, or desserts. The food can be dropped off, or you can arrange for it to be picked up at your home. Monetary donations are also welcome to fund milk, coffee, and other items. Volunteers are also needed at the Crisis Center food banks, or you can donate non-perishable food items. Many find this to be a meaningful activity. Here is serving. What the church can do: clothing donation, sweatpants, and t-shirts. As I mentioned earlier, I have not always had sufficient amounts of clothing or the right type. I would estimate that for over my lifetime, 85% of my clothing has been either gifts from family or used clothing from friends. I am very grateful for all of their help. However, for the ladies in the audience, I want to say, try to picture yourselves constantly at the mercy of other people's tastes. During the 1920s through the 1940s, a time that included the period of the Great Depression, eyewitness accounts which were documented in photos show that many mental institutions across this nation were warehousing the mentally ill in conditions of filth and extreme deprivation. These eyewitnesses, many of whom were Christians working in the facilities, observed hundreds of patients in large rooms, completely without clothes, care, or treatments. My own reaction to this information was horror and dismay. Now in modern times, patients are also in need of clothing. Some may have to travel long distances, often on a bus, arriving at a psychiatric hospital with only the shirts on their backs. Here at the UIHC, there are many low-income people who come from other parts of the state or region who are without family support. I started a clothing ministry after I inquired about the needs of psychiatric units at the hospital. I can quote a nurse manager who said to me, "We are in desperate need of clothing for the patients. We've gone through a lot of clothes over the past few months. We would be very grateful for anything you can provide." My clothing drives for sweat clothes feels a need for comfortable items that can be worn by both men and women, even those with weight gain problems caused by some of the psychiatric medications. Before my donations, the nurses were buying clothing for patients out of their own pockets and on a regular basis. Knowing the salaries of nursing assistants, I believe this was a great sacrifice. What the church can do: magazine donations. Improves cognitive functioning, are educational, and relieves boredom. I have found that having books or magazines to read or look at is good for my mental health. Through the Patient's Library at the UIHC, I distribute magazines to 3 adult psychiatric inpatient units and 1 outpatient clinic waiting room. Any donations of magazines by church members will be very helpful. There is a drop box for magazines just inside the UIHC's Fountain Circle Drive entrance, or you can call the director of the patient's library and arrange for a volunteer to meet you at the entrance. What the church can do: fellowship time, coffee and conversation, social interaction. Throughout my life, I have experienced a great deal of loneliness and isolation. Having people to talk with is very important for me and others with mental illness. Having a good listener can be very healing, and you may find that people with a mental illness have something to offer, as well as a unique perspective. What the church can do: provide volunteer opportunities. When I first came to St. Andrew, I helped with the collating and sealing of the newsletters. Later on, the Christian education director had me assist her with things for the children's Sunday school and materials for the women's retreat. It's important to have meaningful work to do, to contribute, and to feel connected to the church in the act of giving of oneself. What the church can do: help with transportation. I've rarely had my own vehicle to get around in, which is also true for others with mental illness. When I first started coming to St. Andrew, I could walk to church because I lived only 3 blocks away. Now, living on the east side, there is a generous group of people who provide rides to church. Some members have also helped by providing rides to grocery stores, food banks, doctor appointments, and other places. I am very grateful. What the church can do: reach out with phone calls, emails, home visits, outings, and cards. I won't mention these women by name, but I can say that there have been several church members who have been like Christ to me. One was my Stephen minister for a number of years, and another was also trained as a Stephen minister and became my friend. Others have been supportive as well. What the church can do: contact legislators. In the past couple of years, I have been in contact with the Iowa State legislators and the governor concerning mental health issues. I distributed my memoir with a handout at the state capitol on the opening day of the new session in January 2012. I was advised by one representative that when the legislators are made aware of public concerns, they are more likely to support laws and programs in response to those who contact them. Now, currently in the United States, the Department of Corrections or prison system is the largest housing provider for the mentally ill, but it does not provide adequate psychiatric treatment. There are not enough community mental health centers or services within the existing centers. There are long waiting lists, and the centers are backlogged. Due to this inaccessibility, many of the mentally ill are falling through the cracks. Poverty, homelessness, and incarcerations are widespread. I asked the same psychiatric expert what his opinion was about this, and he said that it is a very real and extremely important issue. So as you can see, we still need increased funding and services for the mentally ill population, and letting the governor, state senators, and representatives know this would be very helpful. This is also true on the national level. In the present situation, we recognize many of the old problems, and yet there is hope. Writing about recovery, mental illness, and related issues. My publications on spirituality and mental health can be found on my website, hopeforrecovery.com. This site also lists other resources in this area. My book, Voices in the Rain, Meaning in Psychosis, can be ordered through Amazon.com. Thank you for listening. If all the devastation in my life was meant to bring me to this point and this place, it was well worth it. If I can do something to help others, then my life will not have been in vain. Recovery from mental illness depends upon reconciliation and social reintegration. People like me need the support not only of psychiatric professionals, but also the church to pull them through. As I mentioned earlier, recovery does not mean the absence of all symptoms. A person may still have occasional flare-ups of anger and other disruptions of the emotions and mind. As the person learns how to overcome diverse issues and deep-seated problems, a Christ-centered congregation will offer forgiveness, support, and encouragement. Let the grace of Christ extend to all who walk through the church doors. As I mentioned, I have found that medication is important, and I believe that more research is needed to find better and more effective drugs. In this presentation, I have given examples of how diverse organizations can collaborate and work together to improve the quality of life for the mentally ill. If you would like more information on building partnerships such as those I described, feel free to contact me. My email address is on my website and my handout. In closing, I cannot stress enough the role of the Spirit in healing. As I continue on the road of recovery and continue to face difficult trials, I know that my Lord will keep me on track and give me strength, courage, and hope. I hope the church will join me in efforts to improve the quality of life and functioning for people with mental illness and be a welcoming place for all. Thank you.